Hey, I'm gonna take you to a place. I want to show you a place where I spent 11 years. About 4 of that I spent full time when I was laid off and when I took time off to write my book. And the other years I spent off many nights, 4 to 5 nights, and even on weekends sometimes. That is a sushi restaurant. This is a gem. It has closed down, not because of this pandemic, because the chef had decided to retire after about 50 years or so. And he was a wonderful guy, old school, traditional Japanese. His name is Yoshiko Ide-san, and we called him Ide-san. And he taught me a lot of things. And today, I was thinking about this whole pandemic, and he taught me, number one, I certainly learned a lot about hand sanitization. If you haven't seen my last video where I made this homemade hand sanitizer, check that out right up there. But he taught me a lot about not just that, about traditionalism. He considered himself a traditional chef, and with all these new chefs coming up and just becoming instant chefs just like that, without any apprenticeship. He underwent what they refer to as the deshe system. Deshe meaning an apprentice. And he always told me, it was constant babbling about how he had to spend 10 years of just cleaning fish, delivering fish, cleaning, just doing all the menial labor stuff before he could even start doing anything, like making any nigiri or anything, before he could be out at the sushi counter. So he always talked about that, because today you can be a sushi chef and just like that you can YouTube it and apply for a job, and next thing you know you're behind a sushi counter. But this guy was unbelievable in that sense that he was very traditional. If you ever seen that movie Jiro Dream Sushi, check that out. When I saw that, it reminded me of Ide-san. So this here is a small restaurant. I think it's the best restaurant in the Chicago suburbs, at least when Ide-san was here. And it's closed down now, as you can see. It's pretty sad. Spent many years here. They had the specials over here at one time, and it was written in Japanese and English. But he, as I was saying, this guy was very, very traditional, and he wasn't as traditional with us because he needed help really well, so he trained us pretty quick. But he always reminded me about what it was to be a real chef. So of the many things that Ide-san taught me as I was working with him as an assistant, for all intents and purposes, I guess I could say I was a sushi chef, but I don't want to ever claim that, because I know what real sushi chefs go through and what their real training is, and how many years they put into it. So of the many things I learned from him, one thing that really stuck out was cleanliness, hand sanitation, especially now with everything going on here. Now, if you haven't seen my last episode, I actually made some homemade hand sanitizers for all of y'all who can't find any alcohol out there. So check that out up there. As a sushi chef, your hands are touching everything. The raw fish, doors, sliding doors, faucets, everything. So it's very important that one pays particular attention how clean his hands are. And that's one thing about the restaurant that I was at, is it was always running water. You can always hear running water. So, the bill, the water bill must have been just way up there, but there was always running water. And the reason why is because there was always a washing of hands. If Ide-san were to touch his knife, his yanagi knife, he would make a cut, he would cut fish or something, then he would wipe it with his towel, and then he would set the knife down, then he would take that towel and he would wash that right in touching, in reaching distance. He had a sink right next to him, and he would always wash that, and his hands as well. He rinsed it out, put that there. Anything, it was always a systematic thing he had. If he had to turn around and open up the refrigerator, get some ingredients or something, and he put that down, immediately the thing he would do is wash his hands and proceed. So there was always a conscious of where your hands are touching, because it's always contaminating, touching something and then touching something, and inevitably it may get on your food. And if you're dealing with raw fish, you're going to get sick. So I don't know when that was, but about a decade or so ago, many restaurants or many states were coming across, the health departments were coming across a lot of people getting sick from food poisoning, especially at sushi restaurants. So many states like California and many other states started implementing mandatory laws in where sushi chefs had to wear these gloves. When you think about it, it makes sense. When you go to a restaurant and you see the sushi chef wearing his gloves, you immediately feel, oh, good, they're paying attention. I shouldn't get sick here. But you know what? It doesn't replace the washing of hands and the whole process of thinking about what you're touching and cross-contaminating. It doesn't replace that. You know, the other day when I went to Woodman's, it's a great store, a little bit of a drive for me, but the day that they announced the quarantine where people need to stay in their house except for essential work and whatnot, I, like many other people, went out to get some groceries. I didn't know how packed it was, but I went out there, and Woodman's is a pretty big place, a lot of people, and a lot of things there. There was not many shelves that were really empty, except for, of course, the hand sanitizers and sanitizing related things. But as I was shopping there, I was noticing a lot of people had these gloves on. You know, these gloves, the blue gloves. A lot of people had these disposable gloves on, and I was watching them, and I was like, oh my goodness, do they think just by wearing those gloves that they're doing themselves any good? And every single one I was watching, and I noticed, one guy, the first guy I saw, he was holding his phone with his gloves, you know, and he's playing. Guess what? When he takes those gloves off, that phone is going to go smack dab to his face, or he's going to touch a contaminated phone. Another person in line in front of me had the gloves on, you know, and they're holding the cart, which they had, you know, a lot of people are spraying shopping cart handles. Well, that's great. But then you have your gloves on and you're touching everything. You're grabbing, you know, and then you're touching, you're back to it being contaminated. And next thing you know, I see the guy doing this, you know, touching his face. I'm like, people, wearing gloves is not, wearing gloves is just like having skin. If you're not going to pay attention to cross-contamination, things like that, have that, and it's not going to do you any good. That's why, you know, when I go to these sushi restaurants, it's hard for me to. I don't like to sit at the sushi bar anymore. I used to sit at the sushi bars so I could see just how good these chefs are. But you know, it's sad. Because all the chefs, there was a wave of chefs that came in here in the Chicagoland area in the 80s, late 70s and in the 80s. A big wave of Japanese chefs that came from Japan. Ide-san, my teacher, mentor, he was part of that wave. And they came here. None of them are around anymore. The good ones, the last ones had just retired. Some had died. There's not many. There's none of that wave anymore. None of those traditional chefs are around anymore. There are chefs that are coming in that are younger who I go to, and they've you know, they were trained in Japan, and they have the same kind of thinking about cleanliness. Because I tell you what, the Japanese, you know, most of them are Buddhists, but I think most of the cleanliness to them is like a religion. Okay, so A lot of these new chefs coming in good. I'll go to those restaurants, but oh my goodness, I'll go to these restaurants and you got these overnighter guys or people who, they can make a sushi roll, they can make a maki roll, they can make a nigiri or something. You can YouTube that, or they worked at a place. But then you see they're hardly washing their hands. You hardly see the water running. Their knives aren't being washed. They're opening their sliding cases, even with gloves on. They're opening it with sliding cases with their gloves on. Then they're over there touching the doorknob. Then they're over touching something contaminated, then they're touching this, and they're touching a piece of paper. I mean, they're touching everything. And, have you ever watched those contamination videos where somebody touches something, and then it's like that. I'll go to a sushi restaurant, and basically nowadays, I'm just like, I bless my food and pray that I don't get sick, because I tell you what I see with these kids and these guys these days is they're far from what I know of as a traditional sushi chef. So wearing these gloves, unless you use it properly, then okay. If a sushi chef were properly to use a glove at a sushi restaurant, he'd have to go through a bunch of gloves. I would think at least a dozen. You have your gloves on as a chef, right? And then you touch your knife, and then you touch this, you cut that, you put this aside. Then you reach out and you grab a plate to put it on, which that plate probably is contaminated because it came from handling of the somebody in the kitchen. But then you touch that. Then you touch the sliding door to grab more ingredients, and that sliding door is probably contaminated. Then you'd probably have to take your glove off and then put a new glove on. Then you do this, and then you do that. Then you turn around. If you're touching something else, you touch anything, you're contaminating again. Then you have to put just the whole process of it. You'd have to go through a whole bunch of gloves for that to really work. And yet, these sushi chefs, they go through one pair of gloves every 2, 3, 4, maybe a whole shift. So it's pretty sad to see. I don't mean to scare you out there, but hey, it's true. It's how these people, how the sushi chefs these days pay so little attention to cleanliness, to the whole process of hand sanitation. So don't confuse me. I'm not saying not to use gloves. I use gloves, especially these days. I use gloves when I fill up my gas, especially. You know how many people are touching that gas handle? You know how many people are may have that COVID-19 and just hundreds and hundreds of people touching that gas handle. I use that when I fill it up, but then I throw it away immediately. So go ahead and use gloves. It's a good idea, but please just keep in mind what you're touching and think about what cross-contamination is, and realize that gloves, when properly used, are good, but when gloves not properly used, they're just useless, really. Now let me segue into another topic that this whole hand sanitization and COVID-19 brought up. When this whole COVID-19 started appearing here in America, and what I was hearing was from priests and bishops here in this country and throughout the world, but in this country, they were using COVID-19 as a reason to stop communion on the tongue, to stop receiving the Holy Eucharist on the tongue, and they were emphasizing it's because of COVID-19. They're using that as a reason why we should be receiving it on the hand. And immediately when I started hearing that and reading about that, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, what are they talking about? I understand. Are they just wanting to push this whole thing, this about communion in the hand that started from you all know. If you don't know, I'm 200%, I'm 1,000% against receiving communion in the hand and touching the Holy Eucharist, because my hand isn't consecrated. And there's a whole theological thing about that, and I'm not going to get into that now. But if I did a video about communion in the hand, so you might want to check that out. But just to keep on topic here, when I heard that, I thought, oh my goodness. So theological reasons aside, I thought, do they even know how stupid they sound? Because they're talking about not receiving communion on the tongue and only on the hand to avoid the spreading of that. Now, do they not realize that the hand is the dirtiest thing next to our feet that we have? It's always touching things. And if you just go through the normal process of a person waking up and going to church, going to mass, which is very few of us these days, but you think about all the things that person touches. From the car, from the things in the house, from the car to they're touching their face, everything that they're touching, and they've got germs all over their hands. If you had one of those infrared things and you had that color dye, if it would show green, their hands would be like neon green. I mean, you'd be lit up green by the time they enter the church. And then they're touching the pew, and then they're touching, if they use missiles, they're touching everything. And then they're shaking hands, these, in the Novus Ordo Mass, they have this shaking of hands of peace, and they're just touching. And then they get up there to receive our blessed Lord, and they're touching him, and then they're touching him and then putting him in their mouth. Come on, how stupid is that? If you're going to get COVID-19 through the Eucharist, you're going to get that 1,000 times more than if you were to have received the Holy Eucharist on the tongue, which we should all be doing. This whole communion on the hand, I want to, like I said, go to that video, but it started as an abuse. It needs to be done away with. We have to realize what we're doing. Our hands aren't consecrated. We're spreading little particles of the Eucharist, which is, if you really believe that's his body, blood, soul, and divinity, then it's falling on the ground. You're stepping on. It's a desecration. Okay. Only reason why we have it is because of all the infiltration that happened in the church. And then here in America, we had the wolf in sheep clothing, Cardinal Bernardine, who pushed it through. When it shouldn't have been, we should not have communion in our hands. It was never a practice that was already something that couldn't be stopped. It was a novel thing, like this novel COVID-19 thing. It was a novel thing that entered the church from bad priests in Europe that came from bad priests in Europe, and it should never have come. But again, I can never have a hard time, because that definitely has to change. We don't need Eucharistic ministers. I mean, if anything, this would be the time for an extraordinary Eucharistic minister, because Eucharistic ministers are not Eucharistic ministers. They're supposed to be extraordinary, meaning if there's no priest, if there's no religious, if there's nobody with a consecrated hand, if there's no sisters or nuns, I don't know the exact detail, but you take all the people, if there's none of them, then there may be somebody. But now we're lining up all these lay people. None of them have consecrated hands. All are desecrating our Lord by throwing him on the ground through the particles and whatnot. And I said I wouldn't get into it, but again, I get into this whole thing when I think about that. Eucharist on the hand is a bad thing. Okay, it's a bad thing, and it's the worst thing, especially when it comes to this whole spreading of germs and being safe. If you think about this, the priest in the old rite, in the traditional Latin Mass, in that Mass, the priest places the Eucharist on the tongue, and if you do it right, old Catechism had old catechisms used to have simple instructions where tilt your head back and stick out your tongue fully. You know, it was basic, but nowadays some priests have to remind people how to receive it properly. But if they do things properly and then the priest does it properly, I know some of you out there say, yeah, but some priests might touch my tongue. And that is true. Okay, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It's happened with me. And if that's happening with you, you know, the day that we get back and we can go back to Mass and we start receiving our Eucharist and everything else, if that happens to you, you know, be charitable and address that to that priest, okay? Because not all priests are perfect. But overall, in general, so I had to say that in general, because there's always exceptions. You know, when I say this, people always come up with those exceptions. Yeah, well, I went to communion and the priest touched my tongue. You know, okay. But in general, most priests, especially the priests that are trained properly, especially priests in the Fraternal Society, St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, and other traditional orders, they know how to do it properly, okay? And if they don't, if you run into any one of them or a diocesan priest who's doing a traditional Latin Mass, again, with charity, with love and charity, just make sure he knows that. But when done right, you have the priests whose hands have been already, there's so much focus on cleanliness when it comes to the washing the hands. There's so much focus on washing the hands. And after he touches the Eucharist, if you ever notice the priest, he has his fingers always touched. He keeps that, after touching the Eucharist, he keeps that, his fingers closed. Even when he lifts up the chalice, when the raising of the chalice with the blood of our Lord, his hands, you know, if you look at that, it's they do it. So much focus is placed on that. It's like so much focus, like Ide-san, the sushi, like my sushi chef teacher, so much focus was placed on doing things right, properly. Okay, there's a certain process that makes the end product so much better. Okay, and that's when it comes to sushi. Here with the Mass, if you look at the process and what the priest does with their hands, and then it comes down to communion, when they place it, you have a much less chance of contracting a contagious virus by receiving communion on the tongue. So in general, again, I say, you have a much less chance of getting a contagious germ or virus by receiving communion on the tongue than you do with the hands. A much less, and that's just practically speaking. That's just talking about practical things. Again, not to get into all the theological and real reasons to avoid communion on the hand. But that came up because, you know, this whole COVID-19 thing, it should have us thinking, oh, it just makes practical sense to receive communion on the tongue, okay? And if you could start there, which is, you know, a sad place to start, because we should be starting with the reverence and the respect of the communion and kneeling and everything else, the theological reasons, instead of something like spreading of the COVID-19 virus or germs or viruses, okay? But, you know, for some of us, for some people out there, if they think about that, then maybe if that makes sense to you and that compels you to do that, good. But from that point on, please Learn why we've always received communion on the tongue. Learn why we need to receive communion on the tongue. And kneeling too. Kneeling at the altar rail or kneeling before the priest and receiving communion. Learn why after that. But suffice to say, this whole thing about receiving communion in a hand is better in regards to the prevention of spreading of germs and viruses and contagions like COVID-19. It's ridiculous. It's flat out ridiculous. And priests and bishops need to look at that just on a practical point, okay? And from there, then they can look at on a faith, because, you know, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, when asked about fear about receiving communion on a hand versus on tongue, he flat out called it out and said it's a sign of a lack of faith, which is true. Okay. So get out there and get some sushi. Don't watch too hard. If you can find a good chef and they've been trained well, stick with that chef. I've got one guy here in the whole Chicago area, maybe two, that I will go to and trust with my sushi. Otherwise, I go, if I eat sushi outside of those places, I am blessing. I'm praying to our Lord, please, you know, not only bless this food, but don't let it get me sick. So get yourself some sushi out there. Know how to recognize a good chef, and that is through the practices, how he cleans his hands, how he cleans his knife, how he cleans his cutting board, how clean he is, and you know, he's not wiping his nose, drinking a beer at the same time. So you know now how to recognize. I would start with there, his cleanliness, and then his techniques and everything else follow his cleanliness. Okay. So go out there and do that, and please think about receiving communion on the tongue instead of the hand. Please, again, I can't say enough that communion on the hand needs to be done away with. It was novel. It's just it's a desecration to our Lord. And so, like I always say, until next time, make a Catholic difference. Connect to your Catholic roots. Engage in life's spiritual battles. Don't just man up. Don't just woman up. BenUp. Hey, this is Rex. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, hit the like button, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell button too, so you get notified on future episodes. So until next time, God bless you.